Well, hi everyone. It's great to be here, and today we're talking about the incredibly exciting world of online video. And our business and many businesses just like ours have taken massive bets in this space in the last few years. From a big business point of view, just a few years ago, it really was just YouTube who had scale in this space. But in the last few years, businesses like Verizon, Disney, Amazon, Twitter, and Facebook have all launched or built incredibly solid platforms in this space. I think what's interesting is to understand why. You get a good sense of why, understanding why, we can get a good sense of what the future looks like. And for us, engagement's really important, but I think it's the growth which is the most exciting in this space. So if you go back to just September last year, when Facebook started counting how many views they had a day in the online video space, they counted 1 billion views a day. And today, they're counting 4 billion views a day. So just in 9 months, they've had a 4 times growth. Snapchat, which hardly had a video business 2 years ago, now counts 2 billion views every day. And YouTube has grown by 50% in the last year. So if you have a look at this growth, I think it's interesting to have a look at what the core growth drivers are. And of course, businesses have shifted their focus, but it really is the rising tide of macroeconomic factors which has had the greatest impact. I'm going to talk a bit about these macroeconomic factors today. So in terms of growth drivers, the first thing to talk about is data. So as we all know, data's got cheaper over the last few years, but it's also got a lot faster. So we've got some data here from Cisco, and if you have a look, in 2009, the average speed in the world was 3.9 megabits a second. In 2014, that moved to 20 megabits a second, and by 2019, Cisco estimates it'll be 40 megabits a second. What's fascinating is how long it takes you to download a video at this speed. So if you wanted to download an HD movie in 2009, it would have taken you roughly an hour. In 2014, that reduced to 10 minutes on average around the world. And by 2019, that'll be down at 5 minutes. If anyone in the room is lucky enough to have access to Google Fiber, it takes 10 seconds to download an HD movie in cities with Google Fiber. So what we can see is there's been a really massive shift, and this data shift has had a huge impact in terms of how people absorb online video. I think from a spontaneity point of view, it of course makes sense that if you're watching video which can take 10 seconds to download, it's very different to watching video which takes an hour to download. So data's had a huge impact. The next thing which has had a huge impact is devices. So at the moment, there are about 3 billion smartphones in the world. A study from Ericsson, which I read a few weeks ago, said there'll be 6 billion smartphones by 2020. What's interesting about that is it's the world which has not had access to the world's information, which will now have access to the world's information. So it's the poorest half of the world who will now have access to the internet, and they really do go from having none of the world's information to having all of the world's information in one go. And we believe strongly that a lot of the information they'll be absorbing around the world is absolutely online video. So what we're having is a situation where there are a lot more people who can access the internet's a lot cheaper, and the internet's a lot faster. The other thing which is super interesting is Moore's Law. So Moore's Law, the output of Moore's Law says that the processing power of devices will roughly double every 18 months. And this means that everything which has happened in processing power for the last 40 years will happen in the next year and a half. I was fascinated by this graph, which I found on Apple's website. The Apple iPhone, the original one, versus the Apple iPhone 6, what you can see is that there's a 50 times difference in the speed of the CPU. And this means that your device can do so much more today than your device could do just a few years ago. I mean, it really is a fundamental shift. What's interesting is if you have a look at all of these growth drivers and get a good sense of what impact they have on the world. This is a graph from a DeFi study called the Acumen Report. And what they did is they interviewed 1,000 young people from the ages of 13 to 24, and they asked them how much online video they watch and how much TV they watch. What they found is that this age group were watching 8 hours of linear TV and 23 hours of online video. So 3 times as much online video as TV. I remember watching an interview by Steve Jobs a few years ago where he was talking about whether or not the world would adopt the Macintosh 2. And the interviewer said to him, we really don't believe that the future of the world, the older half of the world, will actually adopt this technology. And Steve Jobs looked at him and said, yes, but death will really solve that problem very quickly for us. And I thought it was an incredibly abrupt way for someone running a listed company to respond. But this is exactly the opposite problem, right? Or the opposite opportunity anyway. This is the future of the world. Everything which is happening here will definitely diffuse through the rest of the world, and also this age group only continues to grow. At the same time, what we've seen is there's a massive reduction in TV viewership. So in my childhood, I certainly watched a lot of MTV, and I think a lot of our lives had MTV as we were growing up. So this is a study done by Jeffries and Nielsen, where they had a look at Viacom's viewership. What they found is that there was a 34% reduction in viewership of MTV, a 34% reduction of Nickelodeon, and a 30% reduction in Comedy Central. So online video is growing really fast, and it is at the cost of linear television. I think this is a really interesting way of looking at this. So in the concrete pavemented section of the world, you find broadcast and publishing, where big business decides what people watch. But I think the way that the world is going to work is that the environments where they give the power to the user to decide what they want to watch and when they want to watch it is absolutely where the future is. And I think the world's going to win on the right-hand side here. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Karen Nelson-Field. So I've spent the majority of my time implementing online video campaigns and strategies around online video. And we're very fortunate to have Karen with us, who has a history and an incredibly acclaimed history in the space of the academic side of online video. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Karen.
Thank you for having me. Don't hold it against me. Yes, I'm an academic, but I consider myself a pracademic, which means I kind of apply. I work with a lot of brands, so we apply what we find. So I've been a researcher in media science actually for 10 years. My original work and my original PhD was traditional media, but in the last 5 years, I've kind of worked in the new media space. But what my research does is it kind of focuses on efficiency and effectiveness of different platforms. And for those of you who actually know any of my work in the past, you know that I'm not shy to challenge hype and unsubstantiated claims from those that particularly around the engagement space and amplification space. So, and some of the findings I'm going to talk through today are no different. But what I wanted to quickly say is, to John's point, I've been working in 10 years as an academic, but I've literally just this year established a Centre for Digital Video Intelligence. And the reason why we've established a Centre for Digital Video Intelligence and brought in a whole lot of other professoriate and PhDs to work with me, other than all things digital, is because of the incredible opportunity that it renders to marketers. And for all the same reasons about the growth, about the incredible opportunity in terms of engagement with clients, engagement with consumers, for me, the efficiency game changer is placement relevancy. So from a research perspective, this is why I love this medium. Apart from the fact it offers sight, sound, entertainment, vast and fast reach, but this concept of placement relevancy. So we know that advertising has its greatest effect when it actually hits close to the consumer or close to the purchase occasion. So there's this concept of recency, which means you only need to hit someone once when they're in the market to buy and when it's close to the purchase occasion for it to have its greatest effect. So we are actually not believers of frequency. So anyone who knows Erwin Efron's work, he kind of talks about this concept of reach, don't teach. And that's great. So from a media buying perspective, it sounds fantastic, get as close or place your media as close to the purchase occasion you can. But the problem, of course, is this concept, is the fact that there's this near random distribution of purchase behaviour. So in traditional media, you don't know when the purchase occasion is going to happen. So what happens is media buyers, essentially, you have to have very high-reaching, continuous strategies that you hope to God reaches those that are in the market to buy. So it becomes very, very expensive, and there's a lot of wastage around that. So what I love about this industry is I kind of talk about it as audience wastage is yesterday's curse. So for those that are in this space, you can move way beyond demographics, which are actually a poor proxy for purchase behaviour anyway, but move into kind of contextual and behavioural targeting and any recency planning kind of space. So I will say, though, there's more work to be done, and this is what we're actually being kind of commissioned to do. So how close to the purchase occasion? What are the perimeters around contextual targeting? What are the elasticities? So watch this space. So John, when he invited me, my firm invited me, they also wanted me to talk about some of the core research that I've done over the years. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about where I started on this journey and a little bit about my content, I guess the characteristics of good content. About 3 or 4 years ago, I kind of picked it that content would be kind of the next big thing in the digital space, definitely. So I guess was a little overwhelmed, and I often am, by the ephemeral and case study based research that's out there, and sort of wanted to understand myself what were the characteristics of good content. Not just what's the top 10 in the video chart at the moment, but what is the science behind it? And sure, there is some art, but I'll get to that. So essentially what I did is I spent 2 years. Yes, it's slow, but it was a huge, large-scale study. There were 35 of us involved. We did 5 data sets. There were about 9 different studies within those 2 years. We looked at distribution, creative, branding variables. We had user-generated, and we used branded content. And the reason why we did all of that, because you need some idea that the patterns hold across data. So let me just get into the content side of it, and some of this is probably not that surprising to you, but we started with, I built an emotions grid, which if you've read my book, you'll see where this all comes from. It's very theoretically based. And it's the concept that arousal or things, so emotions that make you, laugh out loud or cry, have a physiological response, are those that are responsible for cognitive behavioural responses, so it gets you to do stuff. So we decided to start there. So I developed this grid, which essentially had a series of high arousal and low arousal emotions, but I also wanted to look at valence to see if there were any differences there. And some of you might be thinking, well, sort of testing emotions is actually quite subjective, and it is, but we minimise that subjectivity by having pairs versus any sort of scaled responses, and we also triple-coded most of the videos. So what I'm about to tell you is actually probably not that controversial, but we'll get to that. Not surprisingly, we found that arousal is key. In fact, high arousal content shares twice as much as low arousal content, which probably doesn't surprise you. But what may surprise you is that we didn't find a significant difference between positive and negative. So a high arousal negative video shared slightly less, but not significantly less than a high arousal positive video. But I often say, good on you, brand manager, if you're prepared to put a high arousal negative piece of content out there. I think this is the next, this is one that a lot of people are kind of a bit shocked with. So in addition to emotions, we also threw in and disentangled talent. So I wanted to understand, I get this concept all the time, you just put a cute baby or a hot guy or a cute animal on a piece of content and it will get shared. Well, that's actually rubbish. The reality is that if you put a dog in a video, it can be a success or a non-success. But the key to that is actually the arousal or the emotions behind that. So if it's a cute dog that does something really funny and makes you laugh, fine, but it could be a cute dog that does something really stupid and it's really boring and you don't do anything with it. So the whole concept that you just chuck in some sort of superstar or you a sexy chick or whatever it might be is actually misleading. So I just wanted to say this is the importance of balanced measurement, and this is where I kind of come into it because a lot of the research that you see kind of looks at the top 20 videos and these are the characteristics of those. The reality is the characteristics of the top 20 are quite often the characteristics of the bottom 1,020. So you really need to, when you're doing research, make sure that you have a balanced scale. This one, I always get the question, content is entertainment, so if we actually put our brand in there, it will put people off sharing. And the reality is that is true. So marketers of content, I think there's 1/3 the amount of branding that there is against TV ads. But what I did is I tried to understand whether sharing was in fact impacted by the degree to which the brand appeared and how early it appeared. But here's the myth. it makes no difference. So branding is not the enemy of content marketing. We couldn't find any differences between high and low arousal, nor the degree to which it was shared. So I think that's a pretty exciting thing for marketers. And we all know that if your brand's not present, it doesn't have to be corny and out there and hello, this is my brand. But if it's integrated well, at the end of the day, if you don't incorporate your branding message, essentially it's money down the drain. Or worse, it's money in your competitor's pocket. So I kind of often say to marketers, you need to shift from thinking branding being the extra to branding being the star. And I think that's a fitting shift for MoFilm, given your model.
Well, thanks, Karen. So I think Karen's given us a really interesting overview of what to include in the creative content you're building. We'd like to talk a bit about different models in order to create content. So MoFilm is a different disruptive model, and there are lots of different models emerging. I think if you go back just a few years ago, the vast majority of content in the world was being created in the same way. You had a creative department, a production department, and a media department. And I think what often used to happen is the content would, the sort of communication would flow downstream. So the creative team wouldn't spend nearly enough time talking to the media team about where the content would end up being. And so I think this is the way that most of the great content in the world is being created, but I think there are some really innovative ways that we can sort of shake this model up and look at different ways of doing things. And I'd like to talk about one now. So this is the MoFilm model, and up front you've got the same creative process where you come up with a sort of creative platform for filmmakers to take off and create really interesting films. Once you've got that creative idea buttoned down, you would then take it to a distributed creator base. So this is filmmakers all around the world who could take that creative idea and create their own interpretation of what a film should look like. A lot of the time there's a lot of sort of go-between between the creative department and the production department in this process. And the output is a distributed volume of films with different ideas which have come from all around the world. So I'd like to sort of show a video now of some of the content which has been created using this model over the last few years. In fact, all of the videos in this have come from the last year. So we've created 22,000 films using this method of filmmaking over the last few years. I think this type of platform comes into its own when you have an agreed big creative idea and you want executions with local insights all around the world. So we have campaigns which are built by filmmakers in Vietnam and Thailand and Sri Lanka and South Africa and pretty much everywhere around the world, all off the base of this sort of big creative idea. And I think a really interesting, different way of creating film. So I don't think this will ever replace the way that is being used at the moment by the vast majority of brands, but I think it's an interesting, different way of looking at creating content. I'd like to talk about one other model. So if you think about the linear model, which was creative, production, and media, if you put all of those together into one room, I think there'd be some obvious benefits. I think the biggest one is the insight which you would gain. And when I talk about media, I think media can be interchanged with audience. So I think what's interesting about this is that if you have the same people who are creating the content and the same people who are distributing the content in the room together, you can get a really sort of deep level of sort of understanding about what your audience likes. I think one of the biggest businesses in the world at the moment, which has had the most success in this space, is BuzzFeed. This is just a few days ago. They launched 9 videos in one day, and they had 4 million views of that content. I think what's really interesting is if you speak to the editor of this channel, he knows exactly what works and exactly what doesn't work. And we get really sort of rich feedback around what works, and I'll explain how that works now. And so when they get a brief from a client, they put their insight together with what they know about the brand, and out comes work which we believe is more insightful than the sort of traditional process where perhaps the audience is not nearly as well understood by the creative team. And this is a piece of work which they created a while ago, which got 22 million views over a short period of time. So we've built a number of platforms like this, and I'm going to use one of them, probably the most charming platform we built in the space, to explain why this is so interesting to us. But this is a duo called Ned and Will, and Ned and Will are much loved by their small audience of fans. So they've built 90,000 subscribers over the last 4 months, which we've been working with them on. And the sort of plan is to, from the start, is to build this sort of rich audience of people who are interested in cats and the sort of behavior between cats and humans, and then introduce a brand further down the line. And the reason that I believe this method is really interesting is because of this rich level of insight which you can gain. So this is an argument between two fans of Ned. And what they're doing is they're debating what Ned's character is really about. And there are literally 100 comments in the last month which are just fans of Ned who are debating what it is which makes Ned who he is and what sort of content really works on the platform and what they really like. And what this means is that as a creative organization, we have a very good idea of what our audience likes. And so when we create content, we know what's going to work, I guess. This is another really interesting slide. So this is the back end of YouTube. And what we get in the back end of YouTube is a really good idea of which videos are performing the best. So in the left-hand side, the far left-hand side, you'll see a percentage column. And that's the percentage view-through rate of each video we release. And so each video, we see exactly what the average view time is. And that view time can be used as a really good proxy for how much people like that content. So you take the qualitative stuff, the comments on the YouTube page, and then you have a look at this. And our creative team and our audience development team know exactly what content our audience will like. So when we then talk to a brand and we take that insight and we mix it with what their marketing objectives are, we feel that we can create something really special. And I'd like to show you an example of Ned.
Dear Meow Mix, hello, my name is Ned. Recently, while enjoying your otherwise delightful product, I was shocked and horrified to discover in the box a human foot. It was wearing a shoe, and not even a nice shoe. It was a cheap fuchsia pump. I would be willing to ignore this terrifying, awful incident if you could see fit to send me 50 boxes of free Meow Mix food.
Dad! Stop lying to Meow Mix to try and get free food!
I wasn't! Delete, 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 delete. Okay. Dear Meow Mix, hello, my name is Ned. I am a cat. A very nice one, and I'm clean, and I am funny, and generally nice to be around. Perhaps you'd like me to come and live with you. I could be a good help in testing your delicious...
Dad! Stop trying to get Meow Mix to adopt you!
I'm not! Delete, 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 delete. Dear Meow Mix, hello, my name is Ned. Please help. I am being held prisoner by a very large and unreasonable person. He also smells...
Ned!
Delete, 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 delete.
Okay, so that's Ned, and we've had an amazing amount of fun with Ned over the last few months. And I think, we really like the way the brand integrated here. It wasn't sort of forced, and it was sort of done in a fun, very Ned kind of way. And our audience particularly liked it, and we were fortunate to reach 1 million views over the last few months with that piece of content. And I think, a large deal of the success we're having with these platforms is really understanding the audience well enough to know what they're going to enjoy watching. And so I guess I touched on the points of video distribution. And video distribution really is one of the most complicated and difficult to understand spaces in the world of marketing today. I think if you go back a few years ago, you really only had to understand a few different channels to really understand what advertising was about. But today, just the online video space is moving so fast that it's almost impossible to keep track. You know, so Snapchat launched 2 years ago, their video platform, and they're currently getting 2 billion views a day. So does that mean that Snapchat is something which every brand should be thinking about? I think it's hard to say. You know, Instagram obviously are getting a massive following at the moment. And if you just have a look at this sort of timeline, what you can see is how many players have come into the market in the last few months. I find it fascinating that Facebook only started counting views in September last year. So we're talking very recently that they just started counting views. And by the end of Q1, they went from 1 billion views in September 2014, and at the end of Q1, they went to 4 billion views. And so, you know, the amount of flux in this environment really is massive. So I think it's very difficult to understand exactly where to engage. I think the other thing which is really difficult to understand is what is the value of a view? You know, Vine is a really interesting platform. Their views are 6 seconds long. Instagram, also a really interesting platform. Their views are 15 seconds long. A paid view on Facebook is 3 seconds long, and a paid view on YouTube is 30 seconds long. So I think what we know for certain is that there really is a fundamental difference between these different platforms. And I think it's really hard for marketers to be expected to understand this entire platform space. So I think we find ourselves in probably the most complex space which is necessary to understand as marketers that has ever existed. And I think, you know, this is difficult for everyone involved. So I was talking a bit about Facebook and YouTube. I mean, it was incredible that it took 7 years for YouTube to get to 4 billion views, and yet it took just a few months for Facebook to get there. I think what this sort of signals to everyone in the world is that whatever Facebook sets its mind to, which requires the attention of the internet, they will achieve. I saw that the American government raised $10 million in 2 weeks for the Nepal earthquake victims. Facebook put a campaign live and raised the same amount in a week. And I think, you know, it's just incredible the amount of power they have with the world's attention, and I think, you know, video is a really big part of that. So I'd like to just talk very briefly about a few things, right? So what we know for sure is that Facebook and YouTube are the biggest. They both have billion people audiences, and, you know, Facebook getting about 4 billion views a day. YouTube haven't announced figures for quite some time, since 2012, but I think it's safe to assume that they're around 6 or 7 billion views looking at the rest of their growth figures. So I think, you know, this is really the biggest sort of environment, Facebook and YouTube, and I think it's worth just having a look at how these two are different. So from a discoverability point of view, there's a massive difference. If you upload something to Facebook and you search for it a few weeks later, unless it's in a stream of one of your users, they won't be able to find it. Whereas if you upload it to YouTube, you'll be able to find it with ease. I think the next thing to talk about is lifespan. So Facebook tends to get a far bigger peak early on in its lifespan. You have a real sort of raise early on in the lifespan of a video, and that's got to do with the high shareability on Facebook. But the length of the lifespan on YouTube is far better. You know, you've got this really long tail because of the discoverability of the videos. The next thing is paid views. I discussed this earlier, but 3 seconds is a paid view on Facebook. 30 seconds is a paid view on YouTube. So we're obviously not talking apples and apples here. I think what's really interesting about that is I believe strongly that these two will have to move closer together. I don't believe it's possible for Facebook and YouTube both to be counting views in exactly the same way. I think these two have to move together. The last thing I wanted to talk about is engagement. And certainly from a comments, likes, and shares point of view, Facebook is a lot stronger. You will always get a lot more comments, likes, and shares of your ads on Facebook. But when it comes to average view time, then YouTube is absolutely stronger. We've done a lot of tests in this space, and we found that average view time can be as much as 3 or 4 times greater on YouTube. And that's with the same videos which have far more likes, shares, and comments on Facebook. So this is a really complicated space, but those are just some sort of thought starters. And I think it really is something which needs to be well understood, and I think finding the right partners who understand this space is really pivotal. So I'm going to hand back to Karen now to continue talking about distribution.
Sure. I was interviewed this morning and someone said to me, did you have a eureka moment in the research that you've done in the content space? And I'm about to tell you my eureka moment. I started with content, I started with creative thinking, because everyone said, you know, creative is king. But my eureka moment is actually creative has a small amount to do with the variation in sharing. And distribution is actually a bigger piece of the puzzle than most things. So I lost a lot of sleep for a few weeks trying to understand why the regression analysis wasn't working, but then when I plugged in distribution variables, changed the game. So here's my challenging moment. The reality is the word viral is probably one of the most grossly misused words in marketing lingo today, and only marketers tend to take concepts from other sectors and kind of translate them and morph them into something that works for them. But the reality is we all kind of think of viral content as being positively distributed, meaning that it starts with a small base and it positively distributes to many. Think about, not that you really want to, but Ebola and I guess HIV to some degree and all the other epidemics. And that's where marketers get it from, that it's this viral epidemic that's just, you know, you get a piece of good content and it's going to spread to many. The reality is it's the opposite of that. The diffusion is negative, or the diffusion curve is, the distribution curve is negative. And the reason why this is because the view to share ratio is much smaller than you think. On average, a piece of content takes 24 views for one share, 24 to 1. So for it to spread positively, it'd have to be a lot closer to 1 or beyond that. So remember, this was over 9 studies. We tested this, user-generated and branded content. So viral marketing is not kind of akin to the whole biological epidemic, and I think the sooner that marketers understand that, the better. And so the reality is, if you start with a small base, your diffusion will happen quicker. So you absolutely have to seed it up front. Think of if you paid for 100 views, or if you had 100 sets of eyeballs and the view to share ratio was 24 to 1, imagine how many incremental shares and views you would gain. But if you started with 100,000 and the actual content was much the same in terms of 24 to 1, think of the additional shares and views you gain. So the reality is distribution has a much bigger role to play than most people think. And that's not fun for viral marketers, or content marketers, because they think that if you create good content, then, you know, people will come to it and share it. And unfortunately, it's not that way around at all. So I kind of use this analogy, and I'm sure it's been used before now, but I say distribution is king and content is queen. And that's not to say that content's not important, because it actually does change the share to view ratio, so you can improve your diffusion or slow your decay. And the other thing it does is high arousal content cuts through the clutter, and you can actually, so you have a higher rate of recall, which obviously links to sales. But I will say one thing about distribution, this is really important, and it kind of links back to what John was saying before. I am platform agnostic, by the way, but I will say some marketers get a little bit stuck in this whole concept of brand communities. So reach is absolutely vital for brand growth, but not all reach is equal. And I'm not going to sit here and lecture you on the statistical regularity of buyer behaviour, but in a nutshell, most brands, the majority of their customer bases are actually light buyers, so it skews this way. So your customer base is made up more of people that buy you infrequently than heavy buyers, and that's, again, that's a statistical regularity that's been found to hold over hundreds of categories, over hundreds of brands, and it was found, I think, in the 60s by Andrew Ehrenberg. So what that actually means is that for your brand to grow, you have to reach light buyers, or at least not skew to heavy. So from a brand, or from a media buying perspective, it means that the very last thing you want to do is buy media that skews to heavy users, because even though most people are kind of taught that heavy users are truly valuable, and they are, you've got to nurture them, most brand growth comes from light buyers, and there's a huge amount of literature on why. And so broadcast media and traditional media tend to offer that. They kind of skew similarly in that they can get access to light buyers of different brand groups. So I won't go through the studies, but we did multiple studies across multiple brands, and it was consistent finding all along. But the reality, brand communities are the opposite of that. which, you know, is probably not surprising because, you know, if you acquire a whole bunch of fans, followers, whatever it may be, you'd expect them to be heavy users, and that's theoretically, I think, you know, fair enough. But if you focus all of your distribution within brand communities, you will not grow your brand. So my message to people are, make sure that you should distribute and seed, that you do it outside of the brand community and across category buyers. And again, I'm platform agnostic, so I can't tell you whether you should do it on Facebook or YouTube or wherever, but just make sure that that's a requirement. Just don't get stuck in brand communities.
Thanks, Karen. So I think as sort of a parting thought, you know, we believe that everything sort of boils down to choice. You know, the future of the world is about offering as much choice as possible to the user, what they want to watch, when they want to watch it, and where they want to watch it. And businesses which have an old model where they try and interrupt what you're doing to push a message in your direction, we believe that that is sort of part of an old world. And the world we're entering is absolutely the engagement economy, where it's about allowing users to decide what they want to watch and when they want to watch it. And I think this picture is sort of the closing thought I'd like you to leave with. And you absolutely need to build your business in the space where people are walking, not where you think they're going to walk. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.